IMHO 101 Jams. You have Sir Charles.
You got Razor.
Hey, Ron. What's up, fellas?
I'm good. Welcome, everybody.
I'm excited for this show.
That's right. Welcome, world. You know how we do, and you know how to reach us. Hashtag IMHO Talk Show, or hit us during the breaks, 434-422-9101. Today is a special day. This is the show, the Sunday before this election day, November 5th, 2019, for our area. So, you know, as we always and have been doing, we've been trying to keep you informed, keep you motivated, encouraged to know about who is making policy decisions for you. So, we like to say, whether you like it or not, it's your voice, it's your right. You need to vote if you can, and if you need to see about getting your rights reinstated, a little too late for this Tuesday for that. But
you get locked up trying to show up in there.
But go ahead and jump on it, to be ready for next time. Speaking of getting locked up, Razor with the great segue, we have Mr. Jim Hingeley. He is running for the Albemarle Commonwealth Attorney.
Charles, go ahead and give that man a hand clap, because most Commonwealth attorneys not going to come in here with us. So I have to commend this young gentleman for coming in here with us.
That is right. And for those who don't know what a Commonwealth attorney does, he is going to let you know, and trust me, our listening audience, you don't want to miss this, because this, when it comes to our, our criminal justice system or lack thereof, this is something that affects us all. So, Jim, Mr. Hingeley, how are you, sir?
I'm very good, and thank you so much for inviting me on your show.
Absolutely. And then let me get the street version, Charles.
Okay.
For those of y'all that don't know what Mr. Hingeley do, this is the man that you put your shirt and tie on for, and you're real nervous, get your hair cut for, because you done did something you ain't have supposed to.
Allegedly,
yeah. You did something you wasn't supposed to, and this is the man you have to go before. So to me, to Razor, this is the most important elections of all of them. I know sheriff and all this other stuff, and Senate and Congress, but when it comes to the African American community, the Commonwealth attorney is really somebody you want to know who their values are and who they are. So if they're promoting that they are Republican or Democrat or independent, and the scales of justice are supposed to be neutral, you need to ask why before they get elected. Why are you referencing yourself with being with a political party? So this young man here has come to clear the air a little bit.
So, Mr. Hingeley, how about we hand it over to you real quick, so you can more formally introduce yourself and present your campaign to the listening audience.
Well, great. First of all, I'm a Democrat, so let me respond to that. And my opponent, his name's Robert Tracy. He's a Republican. So this is a party election. And I identify as a Democrat because I believe in the values that the Democrats have as a political party. Now, of course, that's a general statement. There are different kinds of Democrats, there are different kinds of Republicans. So I just want to make it clear up front that I'm a Democrat. But let me move on to talk a little bit more detail about what my ideas really are. As background for that, I want to tell you what my experience in this community is. I've been a lawyer for 43 years.
Okay.
And I was the lawyer who started the Albemarle County and Charlottesville Public Defender Office, and I was the head of that office for 18 years. And I've also taught criminal law part-time at the University of Virginia Law School for 20 years. So let me tell you, that experience has given me a lot of insight into what's going on in the criminal justice system in our community. And let me tell you also that we need changes in our criminal justice system. Some of the ideas I have, maybe my first priority, I'd like to start off with this, is ending mass incarceration. You know, we have a problem with mass incarceration in our country. We have a problem with mass incarceration in our county. We have a prosecutor who's in office right now who thinks that jails and prisons should be a first response to criminal behavior and not a last resort.
Mr. Trace, can I ask you a question? Can I ask you a question, sir?
Oh, sure.
Well, in your personal opinion, how important to the African American community is the position that you're running for?
It's huge, and let me follow up on my first priority, which is ending mass incarceration. We know that mass incarceration disproportionately affects the African American community. Absolutely, there's no question about that. So as a candidate, my issue here is ending mass incarceration, and if we can do that successfully in our community, that is going to achieve a large measure of racial justice. And I'm very concerned about the racial injustices in our system as it is now.
Now, mass incarceration, though, that is a mouthful. Like, that's a big term. That's a huge undertaking. So dig a little deeper for us, though. When you talk about mass incarceration, and particularly how it affects minority community, African American community, like we know about whether it's police profiling, whether it's like unequal terms, judgments when it comes to how it seems like black folks get charged versus maybe their white counterpart. So when we think about those things, tell us, break those down for us on how you plan to end mass incarceration, because that sounds like a big undertaking.
It is a big undertaking, and let me break it down a little bit. I think in terms of the disproportionate effect on the African American community, there's 2 points that specifically come within the jurisdiction of the Commonwealth's attorney. One is, as you just mentioned, the charges that are placed. If you look at the charges that are placed against African Americans, it is done disproportionately to the other communities. And then the second part of that is not just the charges themselves, but the length of sentence. If somebody is sentenced to jail, then you have to examine how long the sentence is. And again, we see a disproportionate impact on the African American community in terms of length of sentences. So how do you go about ending that? What are my plans? Going back to my experience as a public defender, when I was a public defender, I sat down with defendants day in and day out and heard their stories and found out about what's going on in their lives. I sat down with their family members. I sat down with the people who brought the charges. But what I saw in my experience as a public defender was that we have an awful lot of people in our community who are charged with committing crimes, who have the potential to change their lives. And we're not realizing that potential because the way the system is operating now. So what I want to do is I want to look closely at people in terms of finding alternatives to incarceration, keeping people in the community. And if we can do that, and when I talk about keeping people in the community, this is part of ending mass incarceration because they're not going to jail. But when I say keep people in the community, I mean keep them in the community after the case is over with strict supervision, because there has to be a supervisory element. And then while they're under supervision, staying in the community, they can be given treatment for whatever is driving the criminal behavior. And we know that big factors in criminal behavior are substance abuse and mental illness. Both of those are things that we can actually give people services and treatment for.
Now, when you say keep in the community, is that for violent or nonviolent offenses?
This is for the nonviolent offenses.
Okay.
And let me.
Yeah, Mr. Tracy, before we go down that rabbit hole, wait a minute. Mr. Hingeley, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I have a question for you.
Yes.
Now, when you say that, I understand when you say violent but nonviolent, but when you have the judge stating that we have a problem with fentanyl now and people dying from that, is that an open gate for people to say, like, okay, now drugs is becoming a violent offense? Because there was a case in Culpeper where a gentleman got 60 years for selling drugs, and I believe the same judge gave the police officer that killed the lady while inside the church, who was sitting in the parking lot, 3 years. So because we have judges, it leaves an open interpretation for what's being done. So it's kind of like and this is not to put you in a box or anything, but it's kind of like you may have the best of intentions, but if the judge and the police officers around you kind of pigeonhole you in a position, how much can you really do? in the overall effects for African American people, or black and brown people, or whatever terminology we're using now?
Sure. That's a great question, and let me answer it straightforwardly. There's a lot the Commonwealth's attorney can do, and that's why this is such an important election. The Commonwealth's attorney determines how a case moves forward, not the judge. The judge in the end is the person who makes a judgment, but the judge can only make a judgment based on what the Commonwealth's attorney presents. So the Commonwealth's attorney has the option, and this is called prosecutorial discretion, the option to make a recommendation for community treatment instead of incarceration. The Commonwealth's attorney has the power, using prosecutorial discretion, to change a charge to make it one that makes a person eligible for community treatment. So let me emphasize that in between the police who bring the charge and the judge who makes the final decision, the discretion of the prosecutor has enormous influence in what happens, and therefore enormous influence on how the African American community will be treated. So let me go back. I hope that responds to your question, but let me go back to the issue of violent versus nonviolent. And this is something we can all look up. I've looked it up on the website for the Albemarle County Police. If you look on their website, the last year, they have crime statistic reporting. And in those crime statistics, the crimes against the person, which are defined as the violent crimes I'm talking about, amount to about 5% of all the crimes that happen in Albemarle County. So when I say I am looking to realize the potential that people have to be treated differently, to stay in the community and be given the services they need to get back on track, I'm talking about 95% of what's going on in Albemarle County in terms of the criminal cases. The 5% that's violent, I have the experience, I mentioned that earlier, to prosecute, convict, and remove those people from the community. That's 5%. But what I'm really focusing on in ending mass incarceration is the other 95%. And so it would include drug offenses as being those sorts of offenses that could benefit from community treatment.
Right.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Hingeley. You're tuned into In My Humble Opinion. We're speaking with Albemarle County Commonwealth Attorney Jim Hingeley, and we're just having a conversation about his platform, the upcoming election, and why he feels like he's the best candidate for the Commonwealth Attorney in Albemarle County. So when we come back, I do have a follow-up question about your most recent comments, Mr. Hingeley, and we'll talk more on the other side of this break. All right, and we're back. You're listening to In My Humble Opinion. You got Miss Max.
Sir Charles.
Raising.
Ron.
There we go.
That's Brother Razor. I was listening to the body this morning.
Yes, indeed.
He said, you listening to the body with Brother Razor.
God working on me, y'all. God working on me.
And we are speaking with Albemarle County Commonwealth Attorney hopeful Jim Hingeley. Mr. Hingeley, I slipped in a little bit late. Forgive my tardiness and for messing up your name earlier. I tried to catch a little church this morning. So again, thank you for joining us. I told you before we went to break that I had a question for you. And, I personally feel like the general consensus is people are kind of fed up with the direction of politics and politicians is going, right? And so we don't want to elect one more racist into office. We don't want to elect someone else that's going to cause more division, negative division into office. We don't want to elect someone who's running under the guise of one thing and then gets into office and does a complete turnabout, right? About face. And so, and I think, I was thinking about this leading up to these interviews. A lot of the politicians we speak to, when we say, give us your background or tell us about yourself, rather, right? And they begin to really rattle off where they went to school and what jobs they've had and different things like that lets us know their professional background. Mm-hmm. But I think this country and this city, Albemarle County, has reached a place where people want to know the person. What type of person am I putting into office, not what you learned along the way or who you worked with and for, right? So when you talk about ending mass incarceration, which is a tall order, as Charles spoke about earlier, why is it important to you, or do you want to end this phenomenon?
Okay. A lot of that answer has to do with my background and professional experience, and that's why I gave it to you. And, you know, I'm not a politician, so let's talk about that for a moment. And I understand how a lot of people feel, you know, politicians say one thing and when they're elected they do another thing. That's not me. I'm not a politician, and you know where I'm coming from. I am coming from a background where I have worked in the community, and I have worked with the people who, for years and years, the people who are charged with committing crimes. And what I see in my own experience in that community is that we have enormous untapped potential to treat people differently. And that's why I'm running, because I know the criminal justice system is broken, and I know it up close and firsthand because of the work that I've done. And I've been committed to equal justice for my entire life, and this is an equal justice issue. So the listeners who are listening to this show do not have to be concerned that there's a bait and switch thing going on here, because this is what my life has been devoted to, and the criminal justice system needs to be changed. And what I've recognized, and what a lot of people are recognizing, is that the Commonwealth's attorney, the prosecutor, is the office that can bring change about and make change happen immediately. This is not something that requires legislation. This is something that requires the right person to be in the job. So let me add a little bit, because I think it demonstrates where my commitment lies to equal justice. So here's another thing that I've talked about in this campaign. You know, we just went through a study in our community on disproportionate minority contact with the criminal justice system. The results of that study have not been published yet, but we invested a lot of money in doing that, and I'm sure it's going to show you know, a snapshot of where we are, and I think it's going to confirm the problems that I know exist and the problems that I hope to solve by ending mass incarceration. But you know, there's a big piece of that missing. The statistics that were studied include police department arrest data, and they include conviction and sentencing data, but they do not include any data for what happens inside the prosecutor's office. So my plan, if I'm elected, is to gather information and data that will be able to demonstrate whether prosecution decision-making is unbiased or not. And that's data that's not now collected. It's not collected anywhere, in my knowledge, in Virginia. I know there's some prosecutors' offices outside of Virginia that do that, but I've made a commitment to doing that right here in Albemarle County. So gathering the data so we can demonstrate what's going on behind the curtain, what goes on in prosecution decision-making inside the office. And then when I gather that data, I'm going to give it transparently to the community so the community can judge our performance on that issue. So I think that's a very important aspect of demonstrating commitment to equal justice, and also showing that my platform goes beyond the ideas, which are real important ones, of ending mass incarceration. But I have a very broad platform in terms of racial justice.
Okay, Aaron?
Yeah. We were talking a little bit off air about your experience as a public defender.
Yes.
And obviously, a public defender, you're representing, and you correct me if I'm wrong, you're representing a lot of people that don't have access to economic resources. Would you think that's an accurate assessment of that?
Absolutely, by definition.
Okay. So I want you, if you can, give me an example, if you can, of just the initial difference from someone that has a public defender versus somebody that's able to hire an attorney, the difference in information, not just you, maybe not you being that public defender, but just initially. Here's the reason why I'm asking that question, is because when people don't have money, they don't have resources to what we like to call information. And when people don't have information, we end up with, I don't want to say the pure cause of mass incarceration, but they don't have the right to proper representation. If something, just initially, just from your experience as an attorney, just something basic that maybe you're not doing it as a public defender, but just an initial difference from myself hiring an attorney to being represented by a public defender, maybe there's some different information that I should be getting that I'm not, if that makes sense a little bit.
All right, well, let me try that. People who are living in poverty have a lot of challenges, and there's no doubt about that. And I think maybe one thing that you're getting at here is that they have some degree of challenge in terms of understanding the process. And
exactly.
Yes. And so
some of those nuances that happen during that process, that if I hire you as my attorney, hey, Aaron, A, B, C, D, and D, we're not going to do this.
Yes.
As opposed to a public defender, not you, maybe, but somebody else saying, take this plea deal, man. Or you know, do you follow what I'm saying a little bit?
Yeah. And that's certainly, I think you're onto something here. And the thing about it is that as a public defender, what I did was to acknowledge that there was this information gap and work hard to close that information gap, because it doesn't do a service to the client to take them when they have these challenges and not work hard to kind of overcome them. And it's a team effort. So and it's hard work, but that goes back to what I was saying before. In doing that hard work, I get to know people at a different level, and I get to understand what's going on in their lives in order to represent them effectively.
Right. Do you think, in your opinion, I'm not even sure if you can answer this, do you think that, now I'm really, my brain computer is working, do you think that people should have the same access to an attorney if you're a public defender as opposed to a paid attorney? So should you get the same exact representation from both parties?
Absolutely.
Now that's a good question. But in reality, does that happen? And then can you explain why that does not happen?
Well, they did a study, and this was a number of years ago, but I was very pleased by the outcome of this study. They studied variables in terms of sentence length and nature of charge for 3 different groups of attorneys: private attorneys,
okay,
public defenders, and court-appointed lawyers. And the difference between a public defender and a court-appointed lawyer is a public defender works in an office that's dedicated to representing indigent defendants.
Okay.
A court-appointed lawyer is a lawyer who takes individual cases and works in basically private practice and only does a few. And they found in that study that the representation by public defenders in public defender offices was comparable to private attorneys.
Okay.
And that court-appointed attorneys, the representation, at least measured by the study, was less effective. So, do I want to sit here and tell you that
you get more time, right?
Yes.
Like when you have a court-appointed, because I know from our community, when somebody says, man, he got a court-appointed attorney, we automatically start getting sad, because we know that, you're just going through the motions.
I disagree.
No, I'm talking about in our community, like how we feel.
That's the perception.
That's
it may not be reality, but that's the perception.
Because we know that they load up the lawyers with all these different cases that they have to try to go through. So I'm trying to play, not really devil's advocate, but I'm trying to be honest about the situation. So we know that, like, I've been in a situation where the court-appointed attorney told me, just take the judge's recommendation for what he was getting ready to give you. So not even really doing the case.
All right. Well, again, it happens, and I'm not going to say it doesn't happen.
Absolutely.
But let me tell you why we have a public defender office in Charlottesville and Albemarle County, okay? A little bit of background. in Virginia, we have new public defender's office coming into communities from time to time. We don't have a statewide system yet. And back in 1994, the African American community came to the local legislator, whose name was Mitch Van Yeres then, and said, we are dissatisfied with court-appointed lawyers. We want a public defender office. We want a professional office that's comparable to the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office, somebody who's dedicated entirely to representing the indigent defendants. And so they came to Mitch Van Yeres, and the African American community took the leadership role on this because they saw a public defender office was a better way of providing this representation. And Grace Tinsley and Drury Brown were two of the African American leaders at the time who led this effort to get a public defender office here in Albemarle County in Charlottesville. And then let me tell you what else happened. Mitch Van Yeres carried the bill to Richmond, and that bill got passed, and George Allen was governor then, and he vetoed the bill. And that tells you something about whether this is a good idea or not. If George Allen vetoed it, you got to believe it was a good idea that he didn't want to have. And he vetoed it for 4 years. And so you didn't get a public defender office here until 1998. And when we got a public defender office in 1998, I was the first public defender. I started the office here, and I started a Citizens Advisory Committee, and Grace Tinsley was on my Citizens Advisory Committee. And so we have had African American representation in terms of oversight of the office, and they have been satisfied that the work we're doing is of the right caliber for this community. So I'm going to have to say that there's a distinction between a public defender office, again, a full-time professional office with resources,
I appreciate that,
and court-appointed lawyers.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Mr. Hingeley, so we're gonna. So you have a little more time, right?
I do. Sure.
Okay. So if you can stick with us through the hour, let us take a quick break, and then let's make sure that we come back, so we can hit on. We don't miss anything that you want to make sure that our listening audience hears. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. We are talking to the Albemarle Commonwealth Attorney-elect Jim Hingeley. Remember, vote on Tuesday. All right, Mr. Hingeley. So, welcome back, and we want to make sure that we get to your key topics and issues that you're running on. So, go ahead and expound on those for us, so we can elaborate.
Okay. Well, death sentences. This is huge. So, I have a lot of experience. I've actually represented 4 men who were charged with crimes that could have resulted in their getting a death sentence. Now, I think it's not any coincidence that all 4 were African American. Thank goodness none of them got a death sentence. But we know that the death penalty is administered in a racially discriminatory manner. There is just no question about that. And we also know that the death penalty is handed out in error. And it's unbelievable that we have a system. And I'll tell you the statistics. Since 1973, 167 people who got death sentences were determined to be actually innocent. And that's 1 in every 10 death sentences was handed out to a person who was actually innocent. Now, people say, well, that doesn't happen in Virginia. It does happen in Virginia. It happened right up the road in Culpeper, the Earl Washington case. African-American man charged with raping and killing a white woman, actually innocent. And he came within days of being executed, but he was exonerated and released. So if I'm elected as prosecutor, there will be no death sentences, period, full stop. And that's a matter of racial justice, and it's also a matter of fair treatment to people who are erroneously convicted and given a death sentence. So that's very important to me. And going back to a question that came up earlier, am I the kind of person that's going to get elected talking one way and then do something else?
Right.
No. This comes out of my personal experience. I have been there with people who are charged with capital murder facing death sentences. I know what this is like, and my pledge is going to be carried out if I'm elected. Now, the other issue that I think is very important, especially to the African American community, is restoration of voting rights after conviction of felonies. Now, I told you a moment ago about the Citizens Advisory Committee for the Public Defender Office. This Citizens Advisory Committee put on a forum back in 2001 on restoration of voting rights for convicted felons. And as a result of that forum, we got community support for changing things. And I was the person who was delegated to go see Governor Mark Warner in 2002 to ask if we could change the process. And he agreed and changed the process, simplifying it and giving automatic restoration to people who qualified. Now, that's the kind of person I've been. I've been an advocate for improving the process for getting voting rights restored since 2002. And I continue to believe that that's one factor that affects people's ability to be successful in the community. If they've been convicted of a felony and they come back and they don't have the right to vote, they can't engage in the community in the same way that other citizens can. So it's very important to me to see that we continue making progress on that.
If elected, Mr. Hingeley, is it within your authority to review old cases of people that may have been wrongfully convicted to open those back up and have them?
No, it is not within my authority unless it's presented, and there certainly can be petitions presented that the Commonwealth's attorney would get involved in, but it takes someone else to do the initiative. Now, let me give one more point about voting rights restoration. You know, my opponent, Robert Tracy, when Governor McAuliffe signed an order restoring over 200,000 persons' voting rights, my opponent, Robert Tracy, went to Richmond and he joined with the Republican leaders in the legislature to challenge Governor McAuliffe's action in restoring voting rights for those people. And so that's where he stands on voting rights. He doesn't want to see people get their voting rights back. I do.
I have a question for you. When we have cases of people who seem to just keep getting in trouble, why don't we administer like mental health treatment to see if they're competent? Because when you brought up the Mr. Washington case in Culpeper,
yes,
his IQ he was a grown man who had an IQ that wasn't even that of a 10-year-old. So when we look at when people are constantly getting in trouble, like going in and out of the system, I don't believe that we really test them to see if maybe there's a mental situation going on with that particular person. Is that something that you can maybe implement when it comes to the time when you sit down and talk to the families and the defendants and the whole things that you were talking about earlier? Maybe seeing if they're even competent.
Yes, that is something, and that's part of my plan for ending mass incarceration, is instead of just taking somebody who's committed a crime like that and putting them in jail, not a crime like that. That's capital murder.
I understand.
But taking somebody who has intellectual limitations, and instead of looking into it, putting them in jail or prison because that's our response. That's how things are now. My plan for ending mass incarceration is say no, keep that person in the community, keep them under supervision, and give them an assessment. Find out if they have mental illness or mental disabilities, and then give them treatment for it. So yes, absolutely, that's something that we need to look at, and something that as Commonwealth's attorney, I would be able to steer people in that direction.
Gotcha. All right. And we have a few minutes left. I know Aaron has a question, but I want to make sure that you also expound on, because I know you have mentioned being involved and being preemptive, when it comes to being in the community. So I want you to, be able to give some ideas on what you want to do in the community. Because I know a couple of your points are, ending cash bail, no cash bail, treating kids like kids, so not trying them as adults, and decriminalizing marijuana. So in any of those you want to touch on, or other things you want to do in the community preemptively?
Well, ending cash bail is certainly something that I pledge to do, and that's a poverty trap. A lot of things that we see in the criminal justice system are poverty traps, people who are living in poverty. So the issue on bail is, should you be released because you're able to return to the community while you're waiting for your trial, or are you dangerous? So to me, it's a simple thing. Somebody has to decide if you're dangerous and you can't be released, or if you're not dangerous, you should be released. It's just that simple. And the amount of money you have in your pocket doesn't really weigh in that decision making for me. Treating kids like kids, that's, we know a lot about about adolescent psychology and brain development. We need to keep kids in the juvenile system and not transfer them up to adult court and try them as adults, because we have resources in the juvenile court, and they're geared to helping the kids who are in juvenile court get back on track. So those are, you're right, those are some of my issues. Decriminalization of marijuana. I can't decriminalize marijuana myself. I would be an advocate as a community leader for decriminalization. But in the meantime, the way we treat marijuana prosecutions now, it hurts people. They get a narcotics conviction, they lose their driver's license, they lose eligibility for housing, student loan aid, all sorts of things. They may not be able to get a job because it's a regulated occupation. So if I'm going to prosecute them, as I must, because if the prosecutor doesn't prosecute them, they get prosecuted anyhow. The court just takes care of it. That's not a solution. So I will prosecute it in a way that eliminates all the negative consequences by changing the charge to something that doesn't carry those severe consequences.
Can I?
Hey,
all right, we got 2 minutes.
2 minutes. I'll make it quick. I went to the Virginia Film Festival. I saw a film last week called Just Mercy.
Yes.
And I'm sure you're aware of it, about guys that are just locked up for life with incorrect convictions. Just from an outside point looking in, do you have any ideas of what we can do to actually speed up the process of why it takes so long for us to overturn some of these wrongful convictions? And the reason being is because those guys coming out of jail and being happy, that's one thing, but their time, the mental health, the effect that it's had on their families, that's something that we can't get back. Do you have any just ideas, maybe off the top of your head, that maybe we can help maybe just speed some of these wrongful convictions up so people that do deserve justice can get back to their families and start living a better life?
All right. Well, number one, let's have fewer wrongful convictions.
Amen. How about that?
And that's what will happen if I'm a prosecutor. There won't be. I've got the ability to avoid that. But there are wrongful convictions. Speed up the process. Yes, I think the Commonwealth's attorney can be a part of that, because, as I said before, the process requires a petition to be presented. And if the Commonwealth's attorney is involved in that, then a progressive prosecutor like me can look at it more carefully and speed it along. And the other thing is, it's not all wrongful convictions. It's also people who've gotten excessive jail sentences, and there's no remedy for them. The war on drugs. People are in jails and prisons for life or for 50 years. And those are people we need legislation to go back and open up the door for reconsideration of those individuals. And we have it now on the federal level, and it applies to federal prisoners. It's called the First Step Act, and they've released thousands of prisoners and saved millions of dollars. So we need something like that on the state level.
Thank you.
All right. Again, Mr. Hingeley, we want to thank you for coming on to, in my humble opinion, and sitting down with us. Best of luck to you on the upcoming election. Hopefully our listeners were really tuned in and paying attention to what the changes that you're trying to make in our community. So thanks again. Why don't you give your contact information for anyone who wants to reach out?
All right. Well, thanks again. And my website, which has an awful lot of information, I ask people to go take a look. It's jimhingeley.com, and let me spell that out. JIMHIN as in Nancy, GELEY.com. And take a look.
All right, sounds good. So, I had a final question for you. I wasn't going to ask it, but the guys tell me I have enough time, so I'll go ahead and throw it out there. I was just wondering, with you talking about, keeping people figuring out a different form of punishment or rehabilitation for those who have committed crimes and keeping them in the community. I imagine you're going to get a lot of pushback for keeping criminals in the community, but I also think about the resources that it will take in order to keep them in the community and keep them monitored and give them everything, all the other things that you're mentioning, right? So I'm sure people are asking, well, how do you plan on funding all that? Well, how do you plan the workload that it's going to create for a lot of people? How are we going to keep up with that? Do you have any thoughts about how this will actually roll out?
Excellent question. And yes, I'm sure that the resources that we have currently available are insufficient to meet the need. However, we have more resources than we're currently
broadcasting from the Mountain Dew Studios in Charlottesville.
We have more resources that we need to take advantage of. Also, if you look at my plans, you have to look at it in the long run. And in the long run, the more people we can divert into community treatment and supervision, the less money we're going to be spending on jails and prisons, and that money can be in turn reinvested. And there's a proposal that people are talking about now called a day reporting center, and they're talking about funding it by removing people from the jail and having savings in the jail fund the community treatment portion of that. So there's a lot of work that we can do, a lot of creativity that somebody who is a leader like I would be can contribute to this process. So yes, it's going to be hard, but I think we can do it.
All right. Again, you were just listening to Albemarle County Commonwealth Attorney Hopeful Jim Hingeley. Good luck, sir.
Thank you again for having me on the show.
Absolutely.